Just wait for the last people to take a seat. So, it's good to see so many people have hung around this late into the conference. This is not too taxing a talk, I hope, for this time of evening. So, talk is, we've got two sort of main themes that run through this talk. The first is something that most of you probably not encountered doing PHP development, which is safety critical systems. Systems where if they undergo a failure, someone's life could be endangered. So nuclear power plants, planes, medical equipment, that kind of thing. The second one is something which I hope you've all encountered before and take very seriously, and that is software security. The goal of this talk is to show you some of the techniques which are used when actually designing these safety critical systems, and then having a look and seeing if we can borrow some of those techniques to engineer better security into our applications. The first thing I'm going to say is beware of lists. You've probably all heard of the OWASP Top 10, a nice long list of 10 really common security vulnerabilities. The only problem is when you sort of look at a list of things and you go, okay, well, I've checked my app, it's not got any SQL injection flaws in it, good. It's not got any cross-site scripting flaws in it, great. You've ticked these all off, and you go, well, my app's secure. I've defended against these 10 security things. What about number 11? Okay? So we're not going to look at any lists today. We're going to look at generalized techniques for looking at security faults, looking at security problems, and mitigating them. Now, obviously, given that this talk is named Nuclear-Powered Software Security, you've probably guessed that we're going to be looking at nuclear power plants a bit as well. So, when we talk about nuclear power, quite a lot of people find it a bit frightening and a bit scary. It's a bit unknown. They don't really know very much about it. And when you sort of say nuclear power plants, and there's been like a fault at one, their mind jumps to this. However, that's not a nuclear power plant. That's a nuclear bomb. And nuclear bombs aren't very safe. So we're not going to actually look at those today. It is actually quite hard to make nuclear material do that and explode in that way. And a typical nuclear reactor won't actually contain enough radioactive material at a high enough purity to actually go bang like that. So you might be thinking, well, if it can't go boom, what's the issue? Why are nuclear power plants required to be really safe? So radioactive material is still quite dangerous to humans, and unlike a lot of dangers, you might think, a lion, a big beast, you can obviously see that and say, well, that lion's quite scary, it's quite dangerous, we should stay away from it. Radiation, on the other hand, is completely invisible. You can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't smell it. So it's really important for a nuclear power plant to prevent any of that radioactive material from leaking into the environment, because it could do a lot of damage to people without them even realizing it until it's far too late to do anything about it. To sort of understand why this is quite a hard problem to resolve and why they need to actually go through these procedures, we'll actually have a quick look at how a nuclear power plant itself works. As with the majority of power plants that generate electricity, the idea is that you would produce a reaction which creates heat. In the case of a nuclear power plant, we have things undergo nuclear decay, and in doing so, they release heat. This then releases hot heat is used to heat water, which we then, in a nuclear power plant it's slightly more complicated because we actually have one loop that goes around the reactor itself and another which goes through a separate loop, through a heat exchanger. But essentially we use that heat generated in the reactor to heat water into steam, which then turns a turbine. The turbine is connected to a generator, and that produces electricity. Now, in order to actually generate that heat, we have nuclear fuel suspended in these rods. And what happens is, over time, uranium, or plutonium, will break down, and the atom will split into two smaller atoms. In doing so, it releases heat, and it also releases some neutrons. These neutrons can bump into other atoms of uranium or plutonium, whichever you're using to fuel the reactor, and they will trigger further breakdowns. In a reactor, we keep this under control so that we have a constant rate of reaction, a constant rate of heat generation, using control rods, which absorb or reflect neutrons into the fuel rods to keep the reaction going at a stable rate. However, unlike a power plant that's fueled by, say, coal or gas, you can't just turn it off. Even with the control rods put in, the fuel rods themselves will continue undergoing nuclear decay, which means they will continue releasing heat. If you don't have a mechanism to remove that heat from the reactor, eventually, when things get hot, and get hotter and hotter, they start to melt. If it melts, all that nuclear radioactive material is going to escape from the fuel rods, escape from the reactor, and potentially get out into the environment. It's therefore really important that at all times, a nuclear power plant can maintain this cooling loop, which removes excess heat from the reactor and stops it from getting too hot. So one of the techniques that they use to sort of analyze these safety critical systems is called fault tree analysis. Now, fault tree analysis works really quite well when we've identified something which we do not want to happen. So, for a nuclear power plant, we do not want it to melt. And we've also can have a think, looking at that diagram, you can probably think of ways that could happen. If that cooling loop was ever to fail, you'd get a loss of cooling event, and that could trigger a meltdown event, which is something you don't want to happen. Now, fault tree analysis is a technique which we use to analyze these trees of events where one thing can lead to another and can lead to another. And you start from an outcome that you don't want to occur, and then you trace back all the potential events that could lead to it occurring. You can then look at ways to prevent each one of those contributing events or mitigate them, and then that reduces the probability of the bad thing that you don't want to happen, a meltdown, from happening. So we could draw a diagram a bit like this. So it's a very simple one. I imagine that a real nuclear power plant will have something that spreads over hundreds of pages, but we'll keep it simple. At the top, we've put our loss of cooling event. We've said that's something we don't want to happen. And then we've had a look at how a plant works, and we can say, well, if a valve in that system, if we've got a water valve and it becomes blocked by debris or something like that, that could potentially lead to a loss of cooling, because the water won't be able to circulate and take the heat away anymore. We've also said that maybe if there's a power failure, the pump that runs that loop would stop running, the water would not move around, the heat wouldn't be removed, and that could lead to a loss of cooling. Now, because either one of these two failures could happen and lead to that loss of cooling event, we connect them up the top here on our diagram with an OR gate. So one or the other could lead to that loss of cooling event. We could develop this diagram, and we could say, well, loss of power, we really don't want that to happen, so we can sort of say, we're going to pull power off the national grid to just drive our pump, but also, just in case the power goes out from the grid, we're going to have a backup diesel generator which we can turn on and continue to generate electricity to run that pump. And because both of these would have to fail in order to get to that loss of power event, we can connect these with an AND gate. On our diagram, we can show that both of the things below have to happen before the next event in the chain occurs. We can also say, well, loss of power, it's a nuclear power plant, right? It's generating electricity all the time. So whenever the reactor is actually on, we're not going to have an issue with losing power, because it's going to be generating a lot of electricity itself. So we've got this special kind of gate. I mean, you've probably heard of OR gates and AND gates before, but in a fault tree analysis, we've got this special kind of gate called an inhibit gate. And an inhibit gate has a conditional attached to it that says, in this case, the reactor's got to be off, it's going to be powered down. And if that condition is false, that we can just ignore that whole tree. And we say there's no way that can happen because if the reactor's on, it's always going to have power. So we only need to worry about this subtree in the event that the reactor is off. So we have this inhibit gate here. Now you might look at this and think, well, that's quite an unlikely failure scenario. You know, you've got 3 sources of power that you can rely on there. But if you remember back in Japan, about 5 years ago now, Fukushima, the reactor, there was an earthquake that happened, and so part of the sort of safety procedure in Japan, whenever an earthquake happens, they shut down all the nuclear reactors near the earthquake. That meant that all the reactors were off. Oops. And then the earthquake also took out the connection to the national grid, so they didn't have any external power coming in. Again, you'd say, okay, well, that's okay, that's fine. We've still got our diesel generators. But I mean, I don't know how much you know about earthquakes, but when they happen out at sea, they also tend to generate a big tidal wave. And the tidal wave came in about an hour after the earthquake and flooded the room containing all the diesel generators. And so they've lost all 3 sources of power within an hour or two. And that actually caused the cooling system to lose power, and then they were struggling to keep their reactors cool. And over the next few days, they all melted down and exploded. Wasn't a nuclear explosion, by the way, it was a hydrogen explosion, which is a byproduct of what happens when it melts down. So yeah, these things can happen, very rarely, but they can happen. So okay, I'm hoping that now you've had a look at that, you can think, okay, how can we use that from a security perspective? I'm going to use an e-commerce system as an example in this system. And so I think a really bad thing to happen for an e-commerce system is for all your customer data to be stolen by, say, a competitor. Okay? You want to keep all your customer data confidential, because if it leaks out, you're going to have problems with GDPR and reputational damage, and yeah, it's quite bad. So that's a bad thing that can happen. And we can create a diagram, and we can say, okay, how might someone break into our system, and how might they steal our customer data? One option might be that they manage to, you've not secured your database properly, it's open to the world, and they just directly log into your database and download a copy. Another possible option is they might ring up your customer service and pretend to be a customer and sort of convince your customer service team to divulge some information that they shouldn't have. That's maybe not as bad as someone downloading the entire database, but if it's a high-profile customer, that could still be quite damaging to your reputation. We could expand upon this diagram, and we can say, okay, so what are the ways that the system could be compromised via that customer service department? And we say, well, maybe someone could social engineer on the phone. Maybe they could get some sort of JavaScript injected into your admin panel and hijack the login credentials of your customer service employee. Or maybe your customer service employees used a really bad password. They've just used a password, 123, and somebody out there goes and guesses it and logs in as a customer service rep and suddenly has access to lots of data that they shouldn't have access to. Obviously, once we've got this diagram, we can start to use it to improve the security of our software system. So what you'd want to do is you'd want to take each one of those items that you've identified as possible leaf things, the starting events and the contributing ones, and you want to consider the risk. we'll say, well, okay, what's the risk that someone's going to manage to ring up one of our customer service employees and convince them that they are one of our customers and get that customer service employee to, say, give them information they shouldn't have? What are the risks that a customer service employee might use a bad password or reuse it and have it leaked out in a different leak if another site gets compromised and the customer service account's password has been reused? So you can see the risk from each item, and you might say, well, okay, we're going to have a look at this particular risk, and we're going to say, well, that's actually quite a low risk, so we're not going to worry about that. It's not likely to happen. But you might identify other items and say, well, it's quite a high risk that this could actually affect our system, so we need to look into ways that we can mitigate that and put in technical solutions or training solutions to mitigate it. Some of the options that you might consider as mitigations are two-factor authentication on your customer service accounts. That turns that steal password gate into an AND gate. It requires both the password to be obtained and for the person who's obtained the password to also obtain that second factor authentication, whatever authentication factor you're using. That makes it much harder for someone to use a leaked password to get into your database. So you've reduced the risk of that security incident happening. You'll notice that we've just mitigated the risk. We've not eliminated it entirely. But having lowered the risk, you can probably sit down and say, well, okay, we're willing to accept the level of risk that we've now lowered it to. It's an acceptable level. It's not likely to happen. We don't think it's worth investing any more money in mitigating, well, what happens if a password is stolen and a second factor auth token is stolen? If it's really sensitive information, you might say, well, let's see if we can mitigate it further and add more defenses in. Finally, not all mitigations will necessarily be technical. If you think about the phishing example where someone phones in your customer services and tries to get them to read out data, you're not going to be able to do very much against that technically. You're going to have to just train your service agents to correctly identify phishing attempts and better ensure that the person that they're talking to is the account holder. So the next technique that we're going to look at is called defense in depth. In the previous section, I highlighted what was an important technique for identifying potential causes of failure in a security system and track their root cause to take measures to prevent them. Defense in depth is another idea that we can apply to improve the security of our systems. Just dealing with the root cause of an issue is quite often not sufficient. In software security, there's a kind of a branch of thinking of we've got this nice big corporate firewall, looks a bit like that, and that's going to keep all the bad stuff out. So we can spend lots of money on this really big, expensive firewall to keep all the bad people out, and we don't need to worry about security on the other side of it because we only have trusted people on that side. But the trouble with this, although it works quite well in practice, and if it didn't, a lot of big companies would be getting breached every single day. It does mean that once that outer shell, that hard outer shell, that big firewall, if that ever gets breached, an attacker can just run rampant throughout all of your systems. The concept of defense in depth is trying to prevent that from happening. Everything we do on the internet is connected. The whole point of the internet is to connect things together. And modern-day computer systems rely on so many different connected moving parts, it's inconceivable that we can actually build one which doesn't have a security failure in some part of it. A piece of software that didn't quite get updated, some default access credentials that someone forgot to change. The concept of defense in depth is how we can limit the damage once a security vulnerability does actually happen in our systems. Go back to a nuclear power plant and actually consider how nuclear power plants apply this defense in depth technique. In a traditional setup, you have many different layers of defense. The first one is in the fuel rods themselves. It's an inert uranium oxide, which is not very flammable and can contain the radioactive material quite well, providing the container stays in one piece. Just in case it doesn't, if it breaks or melts a bit, we have a fuel rod casing around the outside, which is there to prevent damage to the internal core of radioactive material. Outside of that, we have a huge steel pressure vessel, which is, again, designed to contain those fuel rods if something goes wrong with them. As a final layer of defense, we have an airtight reactor building. So even if everything goes wrong in the middle here, hopefully it'll stay contained within that building. It even has a further layer of defense in the fact that the plant itself will be walled off with a fence. So hopefully, even if your reactor building is breached, it's only a local contamination, and you're not stuck your nuclear power plant right in the middle of a city, which would be much worse than it being sort of out in the middle of nowhere where there's not very many people around. Each of these layers is there to try and prevent a failure from propagating any further. If we go back to our fault tree analysis diagram, we can sort of elaborate on the other side of the tree this time and say, well, direct DB access, they might get direct access to the server if we've accidentally left it open to the world. They might come in via the web server. That is open to the world by design. It has to be. So they might manage to breach the web server and from there jump onto our database server. Now, let's assume that we can take away the direct access and put it behind a firewall. So that's one layer of defense, so that the database can't be accessed directly. And we've put a username and password on the database, so that even if they were to be able to access it, they still need to get the username and password. Now, should they manage to get access to our web server, they'll have access to that username and password. So another layer of defense that we could put in place would be to encrypt that data in the database. So even if they have the username and password from the web server, unless they can get the decryption key, in order to actually get that data, they also need to be able to decrypt it. So we can store the keys. Obviously, the web server needs access to them. So we could potentially put them inside a hardware security module. That means that they've either got to find a vulnerability in the hardware security module to extract the keys, or they have to sit there on your server decrypting the data. This makes it much harder for them because they can't just take a dump of the database, grab your decryption keys and decrypt it on their own machine. They're sitting on your infrastructure doing something which is probably going to be quite highly intense work. If you've got decent monitoring in place, you might go, well, why is web server 3 at 100% CPU? You investigate and find that there's an SSH connection in from a random country that's not supposed to be there, and you go, someone's trying to steal our database, and you turn that web server off and you shut down access. So you've got a chance to intercept that actor, that hacker, before they manage to actually extract any data. And these are several layers of defense which you can put into your system to make it much harder for that data to get out. Another technique that's used when building safety-critical systems is called zonal safety analysis. The zonal safety analysis is one that's generally used in aeroplane manufacture rather than nuclear power plants. And the idea is you're looking for situations where, although you've applied defense in depth and you've got several redundant backups, one failure can take out all of your backups. So you're looking for things which can cause a common failure in several systems at once. If you're remembering the fault tree analysis, AND gates are good because they make it much harder for a failure to propagate up the tree. And OR gates are bad because either one of the things can happen and the failure will go up. Zonal analysis, if you've got a common cause for a problem that you find with zonal analysis, the effect of that on your diagram is to turn something which you thought was an AND gate into an OR gate. If a common cause can cause two things to fail, your defense in depth suddenly gets a lot weaker. An example, there was a flight in America in 1989, July the 19th. It was a McDonnell Douglas DC-1010, the aircraft pictured. And you might notice something a bit odd about this plane. In addition to having engines under the wing, like most do, it's got this third engine stuck in the tail here. And in addition to sort of having the three engines, it had three hydraulic systems, which were used to control the flaps on the wings and the tail. And basically the entire plane was controlled with these hydraulic systems. As you would expect, they said, well, we want to take care of what happens if one fails. So they had three redundant backup hydraulic systems and three redundant pumps connected to each of the engines. But what happened in this particular flight was something went wrong in this back engine, and a propeller came loose from the jet engine, sliced straight out through the engine casing and straight through all three hydraulic lines, which were packed into a tight area in the tail. Obviously, this meant that the pilot lost complete control over the plane. He couldn't control the flaps, he couldn't control the steering of the plane, which actually put them in a pretty dangerous situation. Now, fortunately, for this particular flight, the pilot himself was a trained glider pilot, and they also had the senior training instructor for this model of plane as a passenger. Between the two of them, they managed to gain some kind of control over the plane with the only control they had left to them, which was to vary the power to each of the three engines. And they sort of brought it into a bit of a glide and managed to kind of crash land it on an empty strip of tarmac some way outside of a city. It wasn't a perfect landing, and a few people were killed in the crash, but the pilot did actually manage to save the lives of most of the people on the plane, which was pretty impressive, really, given that he lost complete control over it. I don't know if anyone's a pilot here, but I think it's a pretty impressive feat to land a plane without any control. What can we learn from this from security, though? For physical systems, a plane, a nuclear power plant, zonal failure analysis is pretty straightforward. It tends to look at a system and says, well, if this thing over here explodes, what else gets blown up? What else can it take out? Will it also take out the redundant system that's supposed to be a backup for that one? Will it take out a system which is backing up something else which will fail because of that one? If you find the instance of this, the system design needs to be changed. You might say, well, okay, this thing's at a slight risk of exploding in particular situations, so we'll move its backup to the other side of the plane, the other side of the building, so that if one of them fails, it doesn't take out the other one. It might initially seem that that is a physical security problem, and it doesn't translate into computer systems. Because generally, when we work with computer systems, we don't work with ones which might explode. I mean, I don't know if anybody does, but I've never worked with one that might explode. So what we can take from this moving into the realm of system security is to look out for areas which, if a security failing happens in one area, it could trigger a bunch of security failings in another system, and look out for the sort of critical links between them. Some examples of this: administrator passwords. Administrator password is a compromise which opens up multiple different avenues to an attacker. If an attacker gets hold of an admin's password, they can probably log in with a high level of access to maybe all of your servers. So although each of your servers is nicely configured and secure, suddenly they've got some credentials which allows them to access them all. Oh dear. Obviously, we can defend against this by requiring two-factor authentication for our admin passwords, making sure they are really strong, maybe limiting the scope. So you might have some administrator credentials that allow you to access database servers, some different ones for accessing the web servers. And that means that if one of those passwords is compromised, you limit the damage which can occur. Another area that might be an issue is shared systems. You might have a microservice system or some sort of front-end and back-end services, but you might share something like, say, a logging server or a backup server. If someone was to get into your backup server, for example, they might be able to download all that data from your database without having to worry about going through all the nice security protections you've got on your web server and your database. Obviously, you need to take much better care over these shared systems. Don't log sensitive details into your logging server. No passwords, for example. Make sure your backups are encrypted. Ideally, put them off-site, put them away from the main infrastructure, so they're a different target to attack that's maybe harder to get to than your web servers. Another thing that you might find zonal analysis useful for, operating system vulnerabilities. It's a fair number of years ago now, but there was a ransomware attack that swept through the UK's NHS. And quite a few other companies worldwide, but the NHS was a big headline, because it's the NHS. It's another example of a zonal security failure. A single failure in the operating system, a single security bug, allowed an attacker to compromise every single desktop system that was running the vulnerable version of Windows. That ransomware managed to spread indiscriminately because there wasn't any proper controls between each desktop machine. There's no need for a desktop machine in the reception to be able to talk to one directly in a doctor's office, for example. But it was able to. So as soon as the ransomware booted up on one machine, it spread to the next, and the next, and the next. And it infected large swathes of the hospital. If greater attention had been paid up front to isolating these hosts and putting them on separate networks, or saying, this computer here does not need to talk to this one, don't let it, and so it can only talk out to the systems it needs to, it would have at least slowed the progress of that virus down and maybe even stopped it entirely. Also highlights the importance of keeping up to date with patches. The vulnerability that was exploited in this case had actually been patched, but the patch hadn't been rolled out to every system, which, if it had been, wouldn't have been a problem. A good rule of thumb here is to assume that every host in your system is open to the internet, and lock it down as if it's got complete access to anybody who wants to type in its IP address. Be suspicious of any traffic coming from outside of that system's boundary. So ensure that it's correctly authenticated, usernames and passwords, as soon as possible. Reject it if it isn't. Thinking in this way will get you a long way towards stopping the damage caused by an attacker once they've breached that outer shell. Even if it's an internal system, you still want to be using HTTPS. You still want unique usernames and passwords for every person who's logging into it. All of these things make it that much harder, once someone's gotten inside, for them to leverage that access to get more access and do more damage. You can also do zonal analysis on data. Data is quite valuable, and it's probably what most attackers are motivated by financial means. And they'll be looking for your customer information, they'll be looking for credit card details, they'll be looking for anything that they can use to make money. So we can look for data hotspots in our system. We can have a look at which components have access to what data and how valuable that information is. Doing so, we can identify particular stores of data which might be particularly vulnerable or particularly juicy for an attacker to go after. And we can then spend time making sure those systems are more secure, because that will give us a higher return, because that's where people will be going. If you defend those better, you're less likely to have a breach. Once you focus on these hotspots, you can mitigate the risks of losing data from them, and it's more effective to spend time in the areas which are more likely to be gone after by attackers. A more robust long-term strategy would be to actually reduce the amount of data in these hotspots. If you've got a large historic record of customer information and credit card details spanning back 20 years, why? Okay. If someone hasn't been a customer for 10, 20 years, their credit card information probably isn't even valid. Delete it. You don't need it. If you reduce the actual amount of data, you actually reduce your exposure to a leak, because instead of a headline saying 15 million customer records leaked by yourcompany.com, it's 150,000 records, which is a lot less bad. And reduce the access from external systems. I mean, does the customer service portal actually need access to your employee data? Probably not. Try storing it in a separate place. If you've got loads of information about your employees, like next of kin details, maybe medical records for health insurance purposes and things like that, keep that separate to your business data, which is on your web application. Final topic we're going to look at is failing safe. One of the design criteria for any system that's related to safety is the ability to fail safely. In practice, this means that if a system encounters a fault, it should be able to shut down into a safe state. With a nuclear plant, remember the key aspect to the safety is to remove that heat from the reactor core, even after it's been shut down. Now, I don't know if you know where this is, but that's a photo of Chernobyl, which is probably one of the most famous nuclear accidents in history. This is an example of not failing safe. The Chernobyl accident occurred on 26th of April, 1986. Russian scientists were performing a bit of an experiment on the number 4 reactor to see what would happen if they shut it down in emergency. And they disabled a lot of the automatic safety systems to take the reactor outside of its limits and actually test this. And essentially what happened was they'd come up with a test plan, and because of a failure elsewhere on the power network, they hadn't been able to follow the test plan as planned. And so when they actually came to do the test, the reactor was in a higher power state than it was supposed to be. So it was in an unsafe state to start with. And they disabled all these safety systems and tried to do this emergency shutdown procedure. Now the trouble with the Chernobyl reactor design is, unlike a lot of reactors, which are the more American and other designs, the Russian reactor design at the time had an issue with the water being used as both a coolant and as a way of moderating and controlling the reaction. Now this meant that should the reactor get too hot and the water started to boil, water's really quite good at sort of moderating the neutrons and controlling the flow between the different fuel rods and slowing the reaction down. Steam is a lot less effective. So as the water began to boil, the water, which was being used to slow down the speed of the reactor, became less effective at doing that, and so the reaction sped up. That meant it produced more heat. More heat, more steam. More steam, more reaction. More reaction, more heat. And it got into the circular runaway train, and they couldn't stop it. And so it melted, it exploded, it caught fire, and chucked loads of radioactive material over half of Europe. As I said, this is an example of not failing safe. When something went wrong, the thing that went wrong contributed to it going wrong more. On the other hand, some newer designs of reactor have actually got inbuilt safety systems which occur even if everything goes wrong, these safety systems will kick in. They're known as passive safety systems. This is an example of a newer design called a pebble bed reactor. And how this works is, instead of having those big control rods with uranium in the middle and aluminium oxide around the outside, they have small amounts of the radioactive fuel, the uranium, suspended in small balls of carbon. Now, carbon is another element which works quite well to moderate the speed of a reactor, and that is actually what's used in a pebble bed reactor to control the speed. But the interesting thing about the design of the balls is as they get hotter, the carbon molecules move slightly further away from each other. This acts to actually slow the reaction down because there's a larger gap between the uranium atoms, which are the ones that are producing the neutrons and sustaining the reaction. This means that the hotter it gets, the slower the reaction gets, and it then starts to cool again. This design of reactor doesn't actually need a water cooling system to remain safe. And in fact, it can last for 3 days without any interaction from any human, and it will remain in a safe state. This means that active cooling system failure, that whole fault tree, we can just put to one side. It doesn't matter. We've eliminated it entirely with a passive safety system. It's something we don't need to worry about. So how can we fail secure? When we are building systems, we want them to fail in a secure manner. That is, when something goes wrong, we don't want to reduce the security of our application. A good example of this is HTTPS. If you have a web server and you have enabled both HTTP and HTTPS to allow them to access your website, an attacker can actually get in between your customer and your website, and they can block all HTTPS requests. Anything on port 443, they'll just drop the packets and don't let it go through. Browsers will, quite helpfully, decide, okay, well there's clearly no HTTPS option for this website. Let's try again on HTTP. And that means that all of your connections are now in plain text and the attacker can read them. In order to fail secure in this instance, we could use HTST, which is a mechanism to actually combat this. You can actually set a header in your request that says, always access this website using HTTPS. That means if an attacker does get in between your customer and your website and starts blocking the HTTPS connections, instead of the browser nicely sending their credit card details over HTTP for them and giving them to the attacker as well, it'll just fail and it won't send anything, which is much better than an attacker getting your customer's credit card details, because hopefully they'll give up after a short while and your customer will then be able to use your site as normal. There's many other examples of systems which don't fail in a secure manner or leak information when they fail. If you've got debug mode on in your framework, it might decide to display some stack traces. Those stack traces might contain sensitive information, passwords, or sensitive user information, which shouldn't be divulged. If an attacker can force an error in your site by putting some dodgy data in and get a nice stack trace, they can get information about your system that you'd probably rather they didn't have. As with everything else in this talk, the important thing to take away from this isn't a list of items to look out for, but a question to ask when looking at the security of your system. What happens when something goes wrong? Can an attacker use a failure of our third-party authentication provider to gain unauthorized access to our system? If yes, you need to do something about it. So, quickly move on, because we've only got a couple of minutes left. Safety-critical systems and the engineering of them is based on the principle that you cannot make a system which is 100% safe 100% of the time. And so the techniques around building these systems look at analyzing the behavior of systems, which could lead to it becoming unsafe, and then taking mitigations to reduce the probability of that failure leading to something catastrophic. The same is true of security. It's unlikely anyone will ever build software which is without bugs and which is 100% secure. But by using some of the techniques, defense in depth and fault tree analysis, zonal analysis, you can use the techniques to engineer security into your systems and reduce the probability that something is going to go wrong. So to recap, we looked at fault tree analysis, a method to identify undesirable outcomes in a system and trace them back through to what could cause them. The extent that you take this to depends on your level of risk. If you're not handling a lot of sensitive data, you might decide to go back on Monday, well, where are we at? Friday morning, and you might go through this analysis on a whiteboard with some of your colleagues and say, OK, have we identified and suitably mitigated the main security risks to our system? If you're dealing with highly sensitive health information, perhaps, you might want to do this as a more formal process. Do diagrams on a computer system software, save them, and keep them. And if you ever get audited by an authority that needs to look at the security of your system, they'll love you if you can produce these diagrams and say, look, this is what we've looked at, this is what we've considered, and this is what we've done to mitigate. Layer your defenses. When you've identified those areas of concern, layer defenses around them. Don't rely on the fact that the application is only on your internal network. You still need to use HTTPS, usernames, passwords, everything you would as if it was exposed to the internet. Look for single points of failure. There's something to be aware of. Systems which, if compromised, can lead to a cascading compromise of other systems. Try and reduce the impact of these failures and take greater care with your security efforts around these key components. And finally, handle failures in a secure manner. Make sure you consider the failure cases. If you're relying on an authentication service and it goes offline, is your software going to default to just allowing anyone to access anything? Or will it lock everyone out? You want it to do locking everyone out, not allowing unlimited access. OK. So, thank you very much. I'm Give Up Already on Twitter.
Yeah, we're out of time, so if there's any question, otherwise we'll carry on. People are asking about the elephants. Not sure if you want to sell them or like for a good price, I guess.
Yeah. So have you got a way of drawing a raffle or?
Yeah, we can raffle some if you are.
Yeah. So we're going to raffle off one of these PHP Yorkshire elephants at the end. But if anybody else wants one and wants to come buy one, I've got a few spares. If you need one for your herd. I'm going to disappear off stage now, but if you want to catch me after the talks, if you want one.
Okay, then. Thank you, Chris.
All right, thank you very much.